Bro, imagine your Amazon package getting kidnapped by a train. And not even by masterminds, just guys waiting on tracks like it's a shift. The Wild West really did get a software update. That part where they just stop the train with cars is insane. I can't decide what's more shocking, the audacity or the frequency. If this is nightly, that's not opportunism anymore. That's an economy right there. A stupid economy, but still an economy. The thing that gets me is the theft chain, not the theft itself. Like, who is buying the random baby supplies and Red Bull? Somebody's auntie on Facebook Marketplace is doing dark work. That's exactly the kind of sentence that should scare you. Because once it becomes liquid, it becomes normalized. And then everyone pretends it's just survival. Which, okay, some of it probably is. But the organized part is not. That's the part I keep coming back to because this isn't one desperate person. This is timing, scouting, trucks, cutters, all of it. And they're bragging about making 25 grand a week. Bro, imagine saying that out loud like it's a normal hustle. What do you do? Rail logistics illegally. That's actually hilarious and horrifying. But that number tells you why it keeps happening. If the risk feels low enough, people get addicted to the margin. And somebody else pays for the addiction later. Usually insurance first, then everybody. Which is the part people always miss when they say, it's just corporations. No, it becomes higher prices, more friction, more theft prevention. Even the small store locking up Celsius is part of the same story. A locked Celsius fridge is such a depressing symbol. The apocalypse would still have inventory management. That's so annoying, but yeah. Once people start stealing the low-value stuff, the whole system is just exhausted. What I don't get is the train itself being so vulnerable. You'd think freight rails would be insanely hardened. Instead, it's like, stop the train, crack a box, hope for the best. And sometimes the boxes are just sitting there for hours. That delay is basically an invitation. Do you think law enforcement can actually out-cat and mouse this? Because private patrols sound good until you realize the tracks are huge. It's a lot of ground to police for a few boxes of printer ink. Bro, a new office printer would be the most boring crime trophy ever. I risked federal charges for toner. That is a deeply unserious villain origin story. But then you hear the adrenaline talk and it gets darker. Some of these people aren't even hiding the psychology of it. They like the rush more than the product. That's the part that makes it feel less like poverty and more like compulsion. Though those things can overlap hard. Exactly, and pretending they don't is lazy. If you're broke, the train becomes an obvious target. If you're organized, it becomes a business. That's the most depressing Venn diagram on Earth. Two circles labeled desperation and profit motive. And in the middle is baby formula. That's the sick part, because those are real households on the receiving end. A kid's birthday present being delayed is funny until it's your kid. Then it stops being a quirky crime story. It becomes trust breaking down in tiny pieces. And people will still say, well, the packages can be replaced. Sure, but the cost of replacement isn't magic. Somebody absorbs that, and usually it's us. Which means the thief isn't stealing from one box. They're stealing from a whole network of people. And somehow the headline is still only about the boxes. I also think the geography matters more than people admit. Bakersfield is industrial, remote in parts, and full of these in-between spaces. Those are perfect zones for things to disappear. Nature's little crime alley. Dude, that sounds like a rejected Batman setting. But the fact that locals talk about it like normal is wild to me. That's when you know a city has been trained to absorb chaos. People get numb fast when weirdness becomes routine. And then outrage only shows up when the wrong thing gets stolen. Like if your phone charger goes missing, nobody cares. But a whole rail car of electronics hits a nerve. Which is kind of backwards because the system is the same. I think the deeper issue is how low the stakes feel to the offenders. They hear federal charges and still keep going. Federal charges versus instant cash is apparently a difficult spreadsheet. A spreadsheet made by someone who does not respect spreadsheets. But if enforcement is inconsistent, that math gets worse. So what actually changes it? More cops or less payoff? Because if the merchandise still has a resale channel, the game stays alive. Right, the warehouse buyer matters as much as the thief. The boring middleman is always the real villain. That's true for crime and probably for every industry. Honestly, this is one of those stories where the surface is funny for 5 seconds. Then you think about the workers, the customers, and the neighborhoods. And it gets ugly fast. Yeah, because the people carrying the cost never chose the risk. That's why it feels bigger than petty theft. It is petty in method, but huge in consequence. Tiny crime, giant invoice. That should be the slogan for modern commerce. And the saddest part is people will adapt instead of fix it. More locks, more guards, more insurance, more delay. More of everything except a real solution. Yeah, and that is how a problem becomes background noise. Background noise with box cutters. That's such a terrible sentence. But that's the world they're describing. I just keep thinking, how long before this spreads beyond there? Or maybe it already has, and Bakersfield just says the quiet part loud. Probably that. Yeah, probably that. And that is what makes it so unsettling. It feels less like a one-off crime and more like a whole ecosystem. Like somebody figures out the train stops, then everybody else just follows the pattern. That is the most depressing version of entrepreneurship. Startup culture really got weird. But the wild part is how ordinary the stolen stuff is. Not gold bars, not diamonds, just printer ink and baby supplies. Imagine risking federal charges for diapers. That is such a brutal sentence, but it is real. And then somehow everybody eats the cost later. That part always gets missed when people romanticize theft. The store does not just absorb it and move on. No, the insurance climbs, then the prices climb, then everyone pays. So the thief thinks he beat the system, and the rest of us get the invoice. That is a disgusting little redistribution plan. What gets me is how public it seems to be. They are literally waiting for the train to stop and then moving in. That is not even hiding anymore. That is scheduling. Yeah, that is calendar crime. And if people are driving cars onto tracks to force a stop, that is insane. That part feels like pure daredevil stupidity. Unless they know the odds of getting caught are weirdly low. Which is the real problem, right? If the downside feels smaller than the upside, people do math real fast. Human beings will absolutely become accountants for bad decisions. And they are talking about some people doing this almost every night. Almost every night is not a crime wave, that is a business model. The ugliest business model possible, but still. I think that is what makes it feel modern, not the theft itself. It is the organization around it, the routine, the repeatability. The old Wild West version had drama and horses and all that nonsense. This version has hazard lights and box cutters. Much less cinematic, same greed. And the really uncomfortable part is who ends up doing it. Some of it is organized. Some of it is just desperation. That mix is what makes it hard to clean up. Because you are not just chasing one type of person. You have opportunists, you have regular crews, and you have people with nothing to lose. And those are three very different problems in one place. Do you think the camera crews and local enforcement actually matter here? Because it sounds like the rail line is basically a moving target with blind spots. Exactly, and the moment a train is stopped, it becomes vulnerable. A stopped freight train sounds like a giant open wallet. That's the saddest way to describe infrastructure. But that is why the transit system matters to the theft. If one delay turns into an open invitation, the whole supply chain gets exposed. And then some person's printer or birthday package just vanishes into that mess. That is the part that makes regular people angry, not just economists. It is personal because it is your stuff. Exactly, it stops being abstract the second your order gets stolen. Suddenly, the heist is happening in your tracking app. Bruh, that is a horrible but accurate sentence. And I keep thinking about the workers around there too. When theft becomes normal, everybody has to adapt their behavior. Locking up soda, calling staff for basic items, spending more on security. That is death by 1,000 tiny annoyances. And then people act shocked when neighborhoods feel worn down. Because it is not just one big event, it is constant erosion. The video also keeps hinting at how people justify it to themselves. Like adrenaline, need, access, all the usual stories. Every bad decision has a motivational poster somewhere. Usually hanging in a really terrible room. But the incentives really do matter. If someone thinks they can make 25 grand in a week, that changes behavior fast. 25 grand in a week is enough to make a lot of people stupid. That should be on the warning label. Not because it is smart money, but because desperation makes numbers look spiritual. People start believing the next hit will fix everything, and then the next hit becomes another night, and another. That is how ugly patterns lock in. I also do not buy the fantasy that this is just one kind of person. There is always a spectrum between survival and predation. And the same scene can contain both at once. That is what makes easy moral stories fall apart. You want a clean villain, but reality gives you a mess. Reality is annoyingly unbranded. Do you think public attention helps or hurts here? Because spotlight can make copycats, but silence lets it spread. Yeah, that is the nightmare balance. You need enough attention to force response, but not enough to advertise the method. And this method is already very advertised. Like incredibly advertised. Which is why the bigger question is whether the system is just too porous. If freight lines can be turned into shopping aisles, that is a structural failure. Not a bad apple problem, a whole barrel problem. And the cost does not stay in Bakersfield either. It shows up in shipping, pricing, policing, insurance, all of it. Modern life really is just shared consequences with branding. That is annoyingly true. Still, I cannot get over the image of people opening random boxes for a living. That is how close the whole thing is to pure scavenging. And the train makes it feel industrial, not personal, which maybe makes it easier for people to do. Distance always helps people commit uglier things. Anyway, this is one of those stories where the crime is only half the story. The other half is the normal people paying for it without ever seeing the thieves. That is the part that sticks with me. Same, because that is how something local becomes everybody's problem. And the weird part is how casual they sound about it. Like they are describing a side hustle, not a federal crime. That's what makes it so unsettling to me. If you wait for a train to stop and just start cracking boxes, that's organized enough. And also dumb enough to still be happening every night. That mix is what confuses people, right? Some of it is opportunistic chaos, and some of it is very deliberate. Cars on the tracks to force a stop is wild. That is not theft, that is a whole movie scene. Except the movie scene is happening next to somebody's delayed printer. Imagine your office printer taking the scenic route through crime, and then suddenly your baby supplies are evidence. That part hits harder than electronics, honestly. Because now it is not just stuff, it's someone's week. Or someone's kid waiting on something basic. That's why the just insurance argument feels lazy. Insurance absolutely eats the first hit, but it never stays there. It gets spread across prices, fees, all of it. Congratulations, everyone paid for the robbery from their couch. The most modern redistribution imaginable. And then stores lock up the random stuff that used to be normal. That's the part that annoys me the most. You end up needing an employee to unlock a drink. A Celsius in a safe is objectively funny and depressing. Funny until you realize the whole neighborhood changes because of it. What do you think is actually driving it most, desperation or enterprise? I think the answer is infuriatingly both. That's the part people want to simplify into one clean explanation. But some people are clearly addicted, some are desperate, and some are running a crew. And once that mix exists, it becomes way harder to stop. Because you can't treat every person the same way. Exactly, and law enforcement has to untangle all of it in real time. Federal agents, local cops, private investigators, that is a lot. The train line has its own little ecosystem now. And still the thefts keep happening. That tells you the incentives are very strong. If the risk is low enough, people will always test the system, especially if they think the cargo is anonymous. That's the psychological trick of it. A box on a train doesn't feel like a person owns it. Until you see the shipping label and realize it absolutely does. That label is the whole moral collision right there. From some box to Debbie in Washington real fast. And Debbie is the one who now waits longer for her thing. Do you think people underestimate how much theft is just friction? Like every stolen item creates 10 boring problems behind it? Yeah, and boring problems are expensive. The real villain is paperwork, as always. Paperwork and human greed, iconic duo. I also keep thinking about the way they describe Bakersfield. Like if a place gets called rough enough, people stop reacting. That's dangerous because then the abnormal becomes accepted. And once people normalize it, the city just absorbs the damage. Did you notice how the video framed it like a modern Wild West? That comparison is irresistible, even if it's a little dramatic. But it works because the image is so vivid. Not horses, just cars on tracks and guys with cutters. Same energy, worse footwear. And probably much worse planning, honestly. Still, I get why the Wild West comparison lands. It feels lawless, but it's really logistics. That's the creepier part. Crime gets scarier when it becomes routine. And routine means somebody somewhere has a repeat system. Exactly. which means it's not just random wandering. They're scouting, timing, escape routes, all of it. That's the part that makes "just catch them" sound naive. Because the people doing this are already thinking one step ahead. And the article keeps hinting the low punishment matters too, which is another way of saying the math works for them. If the downside feels survivable, the behavior spreads. Especially when desperate people hear stories of easy money. $25,000 a week was insane to hear out loud. That is not a side hustle, that is a criminal startup. Criminal startup is wild, but yeah, that sounds right. And startups scale when the environment lets them. That's the real uncomfortable question here, right? Not why someone steals once, but why the system keeps inviting repeat theft. Because once the route is known, it becomes a habit. And habit is hard to police out of a place. I wonder if people in the area just assume the train is unsafe by default now. That's when public trust starts dying in tiny pieces. First the boxes, then the optimism. That is bleakly hilarious and very accurate. It's also why these stories hit harder than they first seem. They are not just about thieves, they are about everyone adjusting downward. Lower trust, higher prices, more locks, more suspicion. A whole economy of inconvenience built from one shortcut. And somehow the shortcut becomes the business model. That's the thing I cannot get over. It starts with a box and ends with a system. Yeah, and the system is the scary part. Because systems don't care if you are shocked by them. They just keep rolling, literally in this case. Anyway, this one leaves you with a bad taste. Like the whole supply chain has a bruise on it. And you keep wondering how many things get touched before they reach you. That uncertainty is what makes the story stick.